Just a warning, this episode contains some graphic material that listeners may find confronting. Tom and I have in front of us an endearing photo of Melissa Caddick and her dog. It's a caramel and white Cocker Spaniel named Peter Pan, and they're sitting in front of her computer. It's taken in May 2020, but like everything else with Melissa Caddick, there is always so much more than meets the eye.
You're lying open just to the side on the desk. You can actually see a handwritten document. And if you zoom in on that, there on the top right-hand corner of the page, Melissa has written something. Look, it's pretty extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. She has made a note to herself that her average profit for that month was $46,000 per day.
I'm going to do some quick maths here. So 46 grand a day, May's got 31 days in it. That adds up to $1.426 million just for the month of May 2020.
And that would seem pretty accurate because ASIC's forensic investigators found that the year leading up to her disappearance, and she disappeared in November 2020, that year was her most profitable. She raked in a whopping $7.8 million in the 12 months leading up to her vanishing.
Welcome to episode 4 of Liar Liar, Melissa Caddick and the Missing Millions. I'm Tom Steinfort, a reporter with 60 Minutes.
And I'm Kate McClymont, an investigative journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald. We're delving into one of the most extraordinary crimes of the century. Melissa Caddick, a seemingly successful Sydney businesswoman, turned out to be a sociopathic con artist who stole more than $23 million from clients, mainly family and friends, who thought their funds were being invested in shares.
Within hours of her home being raided by the corporate regulator, she disappeared.
Where is she? The millionaire is accused of stealing from friends to fund her lavish lifestyle.
She hasn't been in touch with her family. She hasn't been in touch with her friends.
This was a systematic and meticulous attempt to defraud investors.
4 or 5 million? About $10 million.
You name it, Christian Dior, Chanel.
She was living off our money.
She is a survivor and she would have had a plan.
Nothing would surprise any of us.
You know how much we love you. You just come home, everything's taken care of, you're not in trouble.
Hi, it's Melissa Caddick.
In this episode, we're going to look at how Melissa Caddick lured her victims into this scheme and how, without compunction, she targeted her family and friends.
We're also going to explore Ponzi schemes and highlight the eerie similarities between the crimes of Melissa Caddick and one of the greatest financial criminals in history, Bernie Madoff.
This photo that we're looking at, it was taken on Caddick's iPhone and sent to one of her longtime employees, who's asked to be known only as Nicole. It was sent on May 27, 2020, just 6 months before Melissa's crimes were finally exposed. But right at that stage, everything seemed perfect.
Nicole came in once a week to Melissa's home to help with admin.
And look, if you're running a major fraud, you can't underestimate just how much admin is needed to cover your tracks.
Those reams of false paperwork Melissa set out like clockwork were essential in keeping up the facade so that your unsuspecting victims keep giving you their money to invest. What Nicole, the employee, knew then is very different to what Nicole, the victim, knows now.
She is the con artist of the century. I was dry retching when I found out. I just couldn't believe she would do this to us.
Melissa had around 60 clients, and some of them had 2 accounts, their individual investment account and a separate one for their self-managed superannuation funds. For anyone listening outside Australia, super is what you might call perhaps a pension or a retirement fund, basically where your employer puts aside money over your working life for you to then live on when you retire. You choose who manages your nest egg, and generally it's a big investment fund that people go with, but you can also opt to run it yourself, and that is where Melissa came in.
Each month, All those clients were sent portfolio statements, transaction summaries, contract notes and the like, all of which Melissa had to fake. Now, as word of mouth is crucial to attracting new victims, Melissa had to be the mistress of the con 24/7.
At the time, Melissa texted Nicole with that adorable photo of her dog and the computer showing stock prices in the background. It never occurred to Nicole that she should be poring over the photo looking for clues. Nicole wasn't just Melissa's trusted employee. It turns out that she and members of her extended family have lost millions. And Nicole is now looking for answers.
Nicole and her husband Matthew have been so traumatised by what's happened. So we have given them pseudonyms and actors are recounting what they have told us.
I know some people might be wondering how Nicole, who works so closely with Melissa, could have been oblivious to this fraud.
It wasn't like she said don't touch anything. She had 2 screens. She was operating from 2 screens, 2 trading screens. One of them had ComSec because I could see the logo and I could see it going up and down, buy, sell and the rest of it. There was another trading screen, but I'm not sure what was on that one. It was like US stocks and stuff like that. She'd say, oh look, your portfolio is doing really well, here it is. And she was showing me.
ComSec that Nicole referred to there is Australia's largest online share trading platform. As investors were to discover too late, no one can operate a ComSec account in someone else's name. Nicole has been beating herself up, wondering why on earth she didn't ask for her own ComSec login. Why didn't she ask to be able to see for herself what her portfolio was doing?
Sometimes the investors find it difficult to accept that they're not sort of somehow responsible for this, but they've been conned.
That's Bruce Gleeson from the accountancy firm Jones Partners, and he's effectively been the court-appointed detective on this case. Look, over the years he's come across a hell of a lot of scammers and spivs, but he says he's never seen anything quite like the Melissa Caddick case.
Oh, look, certainly dealt with lots of Ponzi schemes before, but this one is probably up there as number 1.
Bruce Gleeson's job has been to follow the money, find where it came from, track it as it washed through Melissa's 30 bank accounts, and finally establish what she spent it on. And his last job is to work out how to liquidate the assets to return money to investors.
It's not all finance though. Bruce does also have to be pretty sensitive to the emotional roller coaster that Melissa's victims are riding.
A lot of the time there's a shame element with investors that get hooked into a Ponzi scheme. They feel as though it's an exercise of poor judgment on their part.
From Bruce's investigations, he says at no point was Melissa's business Malava ever set up to be a genuine operation.
Yeah, he thinks it was a criminal enterprise from the very beginning.
On what we've seen, Tom, I can't see that there was ever a genuineness about the manner in which the funds were raised from investors and any subsequent change in direction during the operation of Malava to try and turn it into a genuine business.
So, scam from go to woe.
That's what the information appears to show at the moment. So a lot of these Ponzi schemes are not just, a mad idea that arises one night. This was systematic, meticulous and deliberate from the get-go.
Back to Melissa's longtime employee Nicole, who like so many of Melissa's victims, wasn't mega rich. Yes, overall, the fraudster stole tens of millions of dollars, but for the majority of those unfortunate enough to have trusted her, the money they invested was their superannuation or other money that they'd been putting aside just to ensure that they'd have a comfortable retirement after decades of working their backsides off.
That's what makes people like Nicole's husband Matthew so angry.
My wife is a good person. She's known Melissa for 25 years. She cannot believe that she has done this to us. My mum and dad, my kids, my uncle and aunt, she's taken millions from us. This lady's robbed from genuine, hard-working families that are less wealthy than she is. She's taken from elderly and young people. It's just sick. It's really sick. She was living off our money. It's just disgusting, and to think she did this to family and friends.
As we revealed in an earlier episode, Melissa moved back to Australia in early 2012 after her marriage fell apart in the UK. She borrowed a lot of money from her brother Adam to get her life going again. So, what does she do next?
Liquidator Bruce Gleeson sees the targeting of her oldest friend, Kate Horn, someone that she'd known since preschool, as basically the first step in this premeditated grand plan to live the good life at the expense of her friends and family.
Kate Horn is a warm, quietly spoken disability support worker and a single mum with 2 kids. All she wanted was to be able to help her children financially.
Kate believed that Melissa had her best interests at heart.
From court documents, it appears that you may have been her first victim.
Yes, so I believe. That's really painful to know. Yeah, her very first one.
So her oldest friend is her first victim?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
How did it happen?
Well, she had approached me, and I think initially when she came back she did get a job for a short while. I think she mentioned that it was a little bit hard working and being a single mum, and she decided that she might start her own business assisting women in similar circumstances. So at this stage we were both single mothers. She invests her own money and does the research on the share market. She could do the same for me.
Her pitch to Kate was that since Melissa was already making money buying and selling shares, it was no trouble for her to do it for both of them. She was effectively doing Kate a favour out of the goodness of her heart.
The first favour she did was to get Kate to hand over her $100,000 in superannuation funds for Caddick to manage. She also provided Kate with advice on how much she should contribute to the super fund that Melissa was now managing. And Melissa also controlled who would do the annual audit of Kate's super fund.
But she didn't stop there. She later convinced Kate to liquidate her share portfolio and hand all the proceeds of that to Melissa to invest for her as well. Over the years, her friend transferred $500,000 for her personal portfolio and $150,000 into her super fund.
Tom, this was her entire life savings. This was all Kate's superannuation fund just being channeled off into the coffers of Melissa Caddick.
And on top of that, Melissa was gouging her another $31,000 in management fees. So stealing her money and charging her for the privilege, needless to say. She made her clients pay this directly rather than being deducted from the investment.
Over the course of the fraud, she charged her clients $500,000, basically for the privilege of pilfering their money.
It's a bit of handy play money, probably a few weeks in Aspen worth out of that.
Oh, but just a mere drop in the ocean of the bigger rort. And she later got her hooks into the rest of Kate Horn's family and stole millions of dollars from them as well.
You can understand why her family might have wanted to come on board, because Kate's portfolio returns as of March 2016 were just dazzling. Melissa was claiming that in the 4 years her friend had been investing with her, Melissa had achieved a 67.4% return for her. Now, Melissa pointed out that over the same period, the All Ordinaries Index, which charts the returns of the 500 biggest companies on the Australian Stock Exchange, it had returns of only 3.22%.
But Melissa didn't stop at her own friends.
After landing her bestie, Kate, one of her next targets was her brother Adam's great friend, Alice, who we met in the previous episode. They'd both worked at oil and gas company Mobil, now called ExxonMobil, where Adam was a chemist. Now, when Adam was working overseas in Singapore and China, Alice had catch up with him at Melissa's house when he came back for visits.
I met her brother 30 years ago. I was aware that she looked after Adam's finances and was, he was being looked after rather well.
At one of Adam's catch-ups while he was back in town, Alice asked Melissa's advice.
In a conversation with her, I was just saying, I'm just a bit concerned about my super and just not too sure what to do. And she said, she could help. And, she said the perfect would be to set up, a self-managed super fund, and I can help you with that.
Alice told her she had no idea what that entailed or how to manage the super fund.
And she said, oh, no, I'll help you with it.
But guess what? Melissa was so helpful.
Well, she came with me to the bank because we had to set up a bank account, and she got me to sign the paperwork. And when they were 2 trustees required. I said, but I don't have a second person. And she said, oh no, that's okay. I can be that because I've done that for others in the same boat.
Now, just going back a step, after realising how easy it had been to steal Kate Horn's money, Melissa set about upping the ante in this con. To embezzle on a larger scale, she needed a better hook, so she established her own financial services company.
In June 2013, she registered a company called Madoff, a name which used the initials of her family. The very next thing she did was to ring her friend, who we will call Rachel because the federal court has suppressed Rachel's details. Rachel was a certified financial advisor who Melissa had worked with back in 2003.
When she returned from the UK the year before, Melissa had asked Rachel to help her untangle her financial affairs with her first husband, Anthony, and to organise some life insurance policies.
In May 2013, Rachel and her husband set up their own financial advisory firm. And in June, they sent their clients, including Melissa, their new financial services guide, which included their recently issued AFSL.
Coincidentally, at the very same time, Melissa set up her own financial services company, Madoff.
But there was one vital thing that Rachel had and Melissa desperately needed: the AFSL.
So this is an Australian Financial Services Licence, or AFSL, and it's really crucial to this story. You can't conduct a financial services business in Australia without one of these. In fact, it's a criminal offence and it's got a 2-year jail term or $22,000 fine if you do get caught offering financial advice without this AFSL.
And Tom, it's not exactly easy to get this licence.
No, it's not. It's regulated by the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. A lot of people might know it as ASIC, which is effectively Australia's corporate regulator. Now, to get a licence, you have to provide some pretty extensive documentation, such as showing you've got the requisite training and qualifications and a clean history.
As Bruce Gleeson told us,
there are a number of checks that ASIC would do as the regulator of an issuer of those types of licences around things to do with their good character, things in relation to whether or not they've previously been bankrupt, and other checks. They're all fairly significant but important checks that ASIC would take.
Yeah, so from what Bruce is saying, it really sounds like those background checks could have been a bit of a hiccup for Melissa.
For starters, there's already the question of her fake tertiary degrees, which she put in her CV. We've already put that up on the website. And I love this bit. She claimed she had undertaken ethics training in order to be qualified as a certified financial planner. Tom, I know this is very petty, which is so unlike me, but in her CV, Melissa claims to have completed the Professional Development Program at the Australian Institute of Company Directors.
The what?
Well, in her CV, not only did she leave the S off her master's degree, but she added another E to professional.
So, in other words, she's a professional bullshitter.
Correct.
Yeah, so Melissa would have been concerned that ASIC would discover that her qualifications were fake. She might also have been worried that when it came to being a person of good character, well, maybe there would have been a bit of a black mark against her name from previous bosses.
Interestingly, Bruce Gleeson suggested that it wasn't just the effort required to get the licence, which, as we know, is quite a lot, but it's not insurmountable. What might have put her off is that she never wanted to risk bringing herself to the attention of ASIC in the first place.
Ponzi schemes generally, what is in the mind of the perpetrator is to try and run this scheme as long as I can, keep it under the radar as long as I can, and by doing that you have this sweet spot where if you've only got a certain number of investors and within a range of a certain number of funds, and you don't have a regulator by which you're properly and regularly accountable to.
Whatever her reason was, instead of getting her own licence, she asked her friend Rachel if she could be an authorised representative using the licence of Rachel's firm. Now, this is how she'd previously operated when working at Wise, where she was an authorised representative of the firm, which in turn held the AFSL.
But look, even if Melissa did end up being an authorised rep for Rachel's firm, it was a headache for Rachel. She'd have to do a whole pile of police checks and bankruptcy checks on Melissa before signing off.
Now, after Melissa asked Rachel if she could use her licence, Rachel said she'd have to ask her husband. Now, understandably, he said no bloody way. And according to her affidavit in the Caddick matter, Rachel said she told Melissa, "Look, we don't want any risk. Having advisors doing whatever they want under our licence is a risk, and I never wanted that." Rachel also told Melissa that she and her husband didn't want the responsibility of supervising other advisors.
How did that go down with Melissa?
Oh, look, Rachel told ASIC investigators that Melissa was absolutely fine about it and said, "Look, don't worry, I'll get my own."
Turns out, though, she never did. Instead, she basically just stole Rachel's licence, took it anyway without getting the signing off. July 2013 we're talking about here. That very same month that she'd been rebuffed by Rachel, she drew up her own financial services guide.
Oh, Tom, you're being far too kind. I don't think you can use the word drew up. She simply cut and pasted Rachel's financial services guide and just inserted her own name in it.
All right, so this is what her clients received. Melissa is an independent financial planning company and the holder of an Australian financial services licence. And the licence number is listed there. She also told clients that their advisor was Melissa Caddick, who operates under the business name Melissa Proprietary Limited.
Melissa also informed prospective clients that she would charge a management fee of 0.75% on the total amount of their portfolio, which effectively meant not only was she stealing their money and faking their returns, she was charging them for the privilege.
Oh, so kind. Now, look, if anyone bothered to look up Melissa's licence number, they would have discovered pretty much straight away it was Rachel's.
But they didn't, not right then. But having helped herself to her friend's hard-earned licence and plagiarised Rachel's financial services guide, Melissa Caddick's Ponzi scheme now had the requisite veneer of legitimacy.
And boom, she was out of the blocks pretty quickly because investigators found that in August 2013, this is only 2 months after she's established Melissa, she issued a fictitious client with a tax invoice from Melissa for $1.4 million worth of what she calls business consulting services.
I know, I love this. Now look, we might be jumping ahead a bit here, but I was fascinated to read her claims to the tax office over the last couple of years because she had to create fake tax invoices to hide her fake profits.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, she had all this money that was washing through her account, so she had to have some sort of explanation for them for the authorities.
Well, exactly. There was no mention that all of this money was in fact other people's. Melissa told the tax office that clients were paying her hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions in some cases, for her sage advice on how to run or to restructure their businesses.
Now, for a world-class liar like Melissa, tax time is really just a great opportunity to get those creative juices flowing. What sort of tax deductions can we come up with? She would routinely write off $200,000 a year in travel expenses, claiming this was for work.
Now, to think of all those flights, Tom, to Aspen, to Fiji, to New York, where she only ever turned left and sat at the pointy end of the plane, to think that it was all work and no play.
Of course it was. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And she also put down that she was spending $25,000 a year on magazines and periodicals. Now, I'm in awe of this. That's $500 a week worth of magazines and papers. The only thing I think would be a hiccup for her, how do you drag the recycling bins out each week? Imagine how heavy they'd be with that much paper packed up inside them.
Well, I'm sure, though, Tom, it was only imaginary paper because Nicole, who worked with her, said she never saw her read a magazine or periodical, but she did subscribe to online stockbroker Motley Fool, which I looked up, Tom. It charges $99 a year, which leaves only, another $24,901 to account for.
Yeah, and what's really interesting now is that because her tax returns were works of fiction, the liquidators of Melissa's assets have actually approached the tax office to try and claw back the taxes that she paid because, well, she never really actually earned anything.
Exactly. She was paying taxes on the proceeds of her crimes.
Now, one last thing that fascinated me is just the psychological techniques that she ended up using to get people to invest.
And look, one of them is, really quite simple. It's that process of acting rich to give the impression that you are rich. And I asked forensic psychiatrist Dr. Julian Parmigiani if we're easily fooled by the trappings of other people's wealth.
Absolutely. I mean, the classic fraud today, someone who rolls into town in a Rolls Royce and in a beautiful bespoke suit and talks about how wealthy they are. And then, if you're half interested, then you'll ask, can I be part of your success story? And that's the hook. That's what gets you in.
A couple of things that really impressed Melissa's clients were her diligence and her efficiency. Here are victims, Kate Horn and Cheryl Kraft-Reid.
She was very organised and efficient forever. For as long as I've known her, even at high school, she was always very organised then. That was an impressive trait, really. Anything I ever needed, if I'd lost a document or anything, I could just call her and obviously she would present it.
Because she looked so damn efficient. It was really just about the efficiency, and it was a bit like Stepford Wives when you stepped into a house with all the folders and how efficient she was in the paperwork.
Michelle, Melissa's personal trainer and friend, and Michelle's partner Billy, they were also victims.
She was very rigorous. If you didn't have documents signed and back to her within the time, she was chasing you, or the girls in the office were chasing you.
The other attraction, of course, were some pretty healthy returns. Was the feedback from your family, though, that she's doing a pretty good job? We're making some money here.
Hey, whilst the super funds are giving us 3 and 4% returns, we're getting up to 10 to 12. So this is a better performer.
Yeah, so it wasn't crazy returns, was it? It was just better than your average, so she must be a good operator.
Yeah, look, it's interesting in hindsight. So I went back through a lot of the records, and I think there was a method to the way she did it. In the first couple of quarters, it was very modest. So, most of us, when we invested, the first year would really look at our stuff and go, oh, okay, what's this looking like? But once the trust and the grooming was there, you actually didn't pay that much attention. And after that, when I go back and look at our records, that's when some of them was about 15%, 20%. It was when you weren't paying attention to the actual figures because you'd done what you thought was right in the first year, and there was nothing extreme in the first year.
Cheryl's sister Pamela also invested.
Well, I never met her. As crazy as that sounds, I did everything on the phone and relied in good faith on her reputation and her history with my family. She came highly recommended, trusted, and that's really what you're looking for, somebody to trust and somebody that's going to be on your side, hopefully. Always very confident, always reassuring, always on the up. Don't worry about a thing. We've got it all worked out. We'll work it out if you need anything else. Very professional. If she said she was going to call, she'd call. If there was something to be done, she'd do it. You took assurance from the fact that she was very true to her word, in a way, and that she did what she said she was going to do. Very professional at every stage.
It was interesting, Tom, how her pitch changed depending on how she was hoping to get her claws into their money.
She had a pitch for everyone, and to some people like Kate Horn, who's a single mother, and later on Alice and Cheryl Kraft-Reid, Melissa was claiming that she wanted to help women achieve their financial goals.
There was also about showing us the things that she had and what she was doing and the travel, and about not needing it because she was wealthy in her own right. So you had this false sense of security that she was doing this because she, in her words, was an advocate for women and wanted to help her friends. So all of that put together just gives you a really false sense of security.
I'm a single mum and I really, Sydney house prices and things like that, it's really hard for young people. My goal was to be able to assist my children with a little bit of a deposit perhaps down the track when I felt that they were ready. Yeah, so I was investing money, I would be topping up my super, I'd do all sorts of things, and the whole time she just knew that, well, I guess I was never going to be able to because she was taking it and spending it.
Billy, who's the partner of personal trainer Michelle, said the same thing.
I met Melissa the first time we had a catch-up to talk about whether we were going to do a self-managed super fund, because the spiel that she told Michelle had always been about how she helped women who had fractured relationships and things like that, and she liked to do that.
Now, another thing that Melissa did pretty regularly was tell people that her books were closed, that she didn't have room to take on any new clients. Cheryl's sister, who had invested with Melissa, told Cheryl that Melissa wasn't taking on anyone new for a while.
This is exactly what Bernie Madoff did, except for the scale of their frauds, Madoff in the billions and Melissa in the millions. The similarities are uncanny. And Tom, it does make you wonder whether Melissa ever studied Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. Or, is it just that these shysters have similar psychopathic tendencies? I'm just not sure.
Well, let's drill down on Ponzi schemes. A Ponzi is basically an investment scam where the money coming in from new investors has to be used to pay out the earlier investors.
Now, the Ponzi scheme is named after that Italian immigrant Charles Ponzi, who was a short, dapper Danny DeVito lookalike who loved to wear boaters and spats, who in 1920 raked in an estimated US $15 million in 8 months by persuading tens of thousands of Bostonians that he had unlocked the secret to easy wealth in the form of postal coupons.
Just like Melissa Caddick, Charles Ponzi's trappings of wealth assured his investors that he was definitely successful. He had this 12-room mansion in an upmarket suburb, servants at his beck and call, a custom-built limousine, a gold-handled cane for himself and diamonds for the wife, thanks very much. He also amassed property, and he later wrote, "The more I bought, the more I wanted to buy. It was a kind of mania."
Charles Ponzi was brought undone when it was revealed that he'd already spent time in jail for guess what? He was caught red-handed forging his boss's signatures on cheques, which was exactly what Melissa Caddick did. Now, she should have gone to jail, but she didn't.
The largest Ponzi scheme in history, where investors lost $17 billion, was run by that man you just mentioned, Bernie Madoff, who was an American financier, a bit of a Wall Street wizard, who was also a con artist.
Bernard L. Madoff was picked up and charged with what's believed to be the largest financial fraud in history.
A $50 billion fraud, the latest blow to the financial world and one of Wall Street's biggest scandals.
The FBI arrested him this morning after he told senior employees yesterday that his business was a giant Ponzi scheme.
Now, this is where the similarities come into it. Caddick and Bernie Madoff, both their cases, there's never any real investment. The scheme basically just collapses when you run out of people to fleece.
Or too many investors want their money back at the same time and your pool of new victims runs dry. Now, this is what happened to Bernie Madoff. In 2008, the global financial crisis struck and investors wanted their money back. As investment guru Warren Buffett once said, "You only find out who is naked when the tide goes out."
And it really does seem that, when the GFC hit, we saw Bernie Madoff was stripped bare.
Madoff began his Ponzi scheme in 1991, and he admitted he had never made any legitimate investments with his clients' money during this time. Instead, he said, he simply deposited the money into his personal business account at Chase Manhattan Bank. When his customers asked for withdrawals, he paid them money from fresh victims, a classic robbing Peter to pay Paul scenario.
Yeah, this is all sounding very familiar here because, as Melissa Caddick later did, Madoff, he turned down potential clients to give off this sort of feeling that investors were special, unique, if they did make it into the club. And like Caddick, he also preyed on a really select group of people. Now, in Madoff's case, it was members of the wealthy Jewish communities of Florida and New York.
There's a really interesting book by Tamar Frankel, a professor of law at Boston University, and her book is called The Ponzi Scheme Puzzle, A History and Analysis of Con Artists and Victims. Now, Frankel describes this targeting that you were just mentioning, the targeting of a select group, as affinity fraud or affinity crime, because the victims share some sort of bond. Frankel said it can be ethnic or religious or people who travel in the same social circles. The common bond gives the victim a reason to trust the schemer. The common belief is that someone from your background would never cheat you. The same sales pitch presented by an outsider would never be considered.
Now, that close relationship aspect is what Melissa exploited so well. She was well aware that because her victims were her friends or her relatives, they'd probably forego the usual checks and balances that we'd normally do because of that innate sense of Aussie mateship and trusting a family member, that they just wouldn't do something like this to you.
I know, and her investors just assumed that her qualifications were genuine. I mean, how many times do you actually check that somebody, what they're saying to you is true? And so they didn't check her requisite licence either. Look, one thing that we should note, we'll come to this later, Tom, but it was an outsider to this friendship group who later did some homework and discovered that all was not as it seemed.
One thing that I've noticed is that she didn't try and fleece anyone from the eastern suburbs private school that her son attended.
I know, I've wondered about that too, and I sort of thought that with school fees being, around $40,000 a year in tuition alone, maybe Melissa thought these people are obviously successful, well-to-do people, the very kind of people that might actually ask questions. Here's Bronwyn Brady from her baby group, who reconnected with Melissa years later when their sons went to the same school.
She would know that I would have the tenacity to sort of ask questions, what's doing it, what fund's behind it, where are your statement, where's your information about the fund. I would have been asking a lot of questions about before I had given her any money. She probably would have known that.
Bronwyn said she was pretty low-key at school.
She never ever tried to sell to me, and the community that I know of at school, people are like, she could be standing next to me and I wouldn't know who she was. Like they said, she never did anything with me. I never saw her at events. They kind of kept to themselves. So I have not heard of any other school community member being a subject to her fraud, basically.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that she did seem to steer clear of people who had some experience in the industry. One of those was her father-in-law, Rodo Coletti. He's an accountant, and this is what he had to say about her.
First impressions always last. When Anthony introduced you to Melissa, what were your thoughts?
This is going to be my son's wife, so I accepted her on that basis. But a couple of the early conversations I had with her left me, how can I put it, a little distrusting of her answers, and therefore I felt I couldn't trust her. And it's, once again, I would not mention that. I didn't mention that to Anthony at the time. She was going to be the wife of my son, so I accepted that for what it was, and I kept my thoughts to myself.
But your first impression was this woman isn't trustworthy?
That was my thought, yes.
What were the telltale signs for that for you?
Just in general conversation, trying to strike up a conversation with her, because I'm an accountant, therefore a bit in the financial fields and that. Speaking of financial type things and associated financial things, and she became too evasive and didn't answer questions and went off at a tangent with things that really didn't make sense. So I decided, well, okay, so much for that line of conversation, we won't have this one again. And it left me with just not trusting her from that point on.
Interestingly, Rodo was right not to trust Melissa, because we've discovered that when Melissa found out her father-in-law was a justice of the peace, whenever she needed a JP to witness a signature or to certify documents were genuine, Melissa would simply forge Rodo's signature. He was none the wiser about all of this until we showed him the forged signatures all those years later.
In Frankel's book, she noted that another example of deception is the con artist's professed reluctance to accept the investor's money, or, perhaps a bit of a perceived soft sell.
She did approach me initially, would my mother be interested? And I said, I'll ask her, but no, they weren't initially. And she, she was crafty because she didn't make you feel pressured ever. But slowly, different family members started to think that it might be a good idea, and it just sort of slowly evolved.
Kate Horn also said that Melissa told her not to tell her friends about investing with Melissa because she'd already had to let some clients go. Tom, they just weren't very diligent with their paperwork. So she really didn't want to take on anybody new.
Other prospective investors wanting Melissa to look after their investments would initially be told, sorry, books are full. But then magically a couple of weeks later, she'd call and say, hey, guess what? Oh, amazing, a place has come available.
Of course it did.
One victim recounted to us their relief at finally being allowed into this exclusive service. They said, Melissa gave me the impression that she was doing me a really big favour in taking such a small investment of $475,000, which to me was my entire superannuation. I was so grateful to her.
Look, this is exactly what Bernie Madoff did as well. He pretended that his investment advisory business was merely a lucrative sideline for select friends. He was already mega rich. So, like Melissa, he was doing this as an act of supreme generosity, a favour for those less financially blessed than himself.
Oh, they're so kind. And just like Madoff, another similarity here, Melissa would pretend she'd already made millions of dollars herself selling some sort of unspecified superannuation product. And now, look, this was just through the goodness of her cold heart. She wanted to help others.
And she told me that she was independently wealthy from creating a system that she'd sold off to one of the large superannuation firms about how to manage superannuation funds. She said that was in her blood. She liked doing that, and she was going to do it anyway, and she was doing it for herself.
In her book, The Ponzi Scheme Puzzle, Frankel also talked about the threats that Madoff and others used. So not only was Madoff doing you an enormous favour by letting you in...
Because the books were closed.
Yeah, exactly. But he also said to them, if you invest with me, you must never tell anyone that you're invested with me.
Now, Caddick's victims told us they were threatened with expulsion if they didn't get their paperwork in on time or they were in any way tardy.
Yes, and look, that gave this added feeling that Melissa was doing you a favour, so you'd better appreciate her efforts and get your act together. Look, another interesting parallel in both the Caddick case and the Madoff case is that in both matters, the corporate regulator ignored initial tip-offs.
Yeah, in 1999, financial analyst Harry Markopoulos had informed the US corporate regulator, the Securities and Exchange Commission, that he believed it was legally and let's be honest, mathematically impossible to achieve the gains that Madoff was spruiking. Now, according to Markopoulos, it took him just 4 minutes to conclude that Madoff's numbers didn't add up, and then another minute on top of that to suspect they were straight out fraudulent.
As Madoff himself later said, I was astonished. They never even looked at my stock records. If investigators had checked with a depository trust company, a central securities depository, it would have been easy for them to see. If you're looking at a Ponzi scheme, it's the first thing you do.
4 points of honesty there for Bernie. Now, look, it would have been nigh on impossible for Melissa Caddick to be achieving the sort of returns that she was claiming as well. For instance, in the last return that Kate Horn received from Melissa, we're talking about September 2020 here, Melissa claimed that in the 8 years she'd been running her friend's superannuation fund, Melissa had achieved, get this, a return of 525%, whereas over the same period, the All Ords had made just 35%.
Oh, look, with that uncanny ability, she could have been Warren Buffett herself, Warren Buffett down under. But that 525% return, I just wonder, is that showing you how brazen her claims were becoming? I mean, this was getting towards the end. She's just about to be found out, but that's just a stupid, ridiculous amount of money. But anyway, look, back to the demise of Bernie Madoff. So in 2009, he was jailed for 150 years and he died in prison in April 2021. It's interesting that forensic psychologists in America have likened Bernie Madoff to serial killer Ted Bundy, saying that Madoff was a ruthless, detached individual who showed little remorse for robbing his innocent victims of their life savings.
Yeah, there was this great article in the New York Times, actually. It suggested that whereas Ted Bundy murdered people, Bernie Madoff murdered wallets, bank accounts, and really just people's sense of any sort of trust and security in finances.
Melissa Caddick showed exactly the same psychopathic tendencies. With absolutely no remorse, she butchered her clients' financial well-being and in many cases destroyed their lives.
Melissa stole another $1.3 million from Kate Horn's brother. His name's David, and he told ASIC this was basically his hard-earned life savings. A bit of this statement was actually tendered in court. He said,
"The industry I work in is hard physical work with the hazard of chemical exposure. I've always worked hard and long hours with the plan of retiring as soon as possible, as the work does not lend itself to an older person. My partner and I had planned to buy a place on the coast and enjoy our later years. This endeavour has been taken away by Miss Caddick, leaving me to work until much later in life. The fact that this cannot occur has brought a great deal of stress and sadness and has greatly impacted my mental health. This money represents both my personal savings and my superannuation. Basically, every cent that I had."
David, who was in the same year at school as Melissa's brother Adam, told the court how incredibly upsetting it was to see his worried mother standing in the Centrelink queue applying for the pension.
I thought the liquidator Bruce Gleeson made a really good point here about how so many of these victims were about to retire, and as such, they've basically got no ability then to recover from this kind of financial disaster.
For a lot of the investors here, it's hit them at a point in time in their life where their ability to recover financially is significantly impacted.
And the frustrating thing is, Melissa knew that I was planning to retire at the end of the year. This year, she knew, and she actually sat with me and said, "Well, we can do that. How much do you think you need for, every year?" And I told her, and she said, "But you travel you like travelling, so let's put another 10,000 for that, and so you can have a nice trip every year."
So she was taking more of your savings to put into your super, which she was stealing.
She was telling me that when I retire, I'll have all this money and it'll be okay because I could retire at the end of this year and it could work. She would look after it.
I just shake my head that she could deceive people for so long and enjoy the fruits of their labours in that way. It's more about her and where she just felt that she was due that kind of lifestyle and that kind and just proceeded to take it because she could. It's just unbelievable, really. I still don't quite believe that somebody could be so invested in their own life that they couldn't see what was happening to the other lives that would be affected by those actions.
Having stolen their money and ruined their lives, in the next episode, we're going to expose the outrageous way Melissa Caddick blew the hard-earned savings of her friends and family.
And just what she did with those millions of dollars is simply jaw-dropping.
Big house, eastern suburbs, looks straight down at the harbour.
You pulled open a drawer and there were all the handbags in sizing and colours.
No, I'm buying Argyle diamonds and, large diamonds.
If you have found any of the content of today's episode troubling, please contact Lifeline on 13 11 14.
Liar Liar is a co-production of the Sydney Morning Herald and 60 Minutes.
It was written and presented by Kate McClymont and Tom Steinfort.
Michael Evans is the Sydney Morning Herald's investigations editor and the series' supervising producer.
This episode was produced and edited by David McMillan with Tracy Hannaford for 60 Minutes.
Kirsty Thompson is the executive producer of 60 Minutes.
For more of Australia's best investigative journalism, subscribe to the Sydney Morning Herald by visiting smh.com.au and watch 60 Minutes on 9 or 9 Now every Sunday.
If you know more about Melissa Caddick's disappearance, please contact the team by emailing liarliarpodcast@smh.com.au.
Some names and voices have been changed in this series to protect the identity of victims.